Sorry, I forgot that I have the role also, not just as a speaker, but a moderator and chairman. So the next speaker is Danielle Roe, and she is works at Diabetes UK, engaging communities and volunteering operations manager at Diabetes UK. And she will speak about stigma of diabetes, because we want to hear also about stigma of other diseases to understand what similarities are there and what difference, because that will tell us maybe something about specific about what obesity stigma is. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, so my name's Danielle and I work for Diabetes UK. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak here today. It's probably important to start by considering why we're talking about diabetes stigma at an obesity and weight-related stigma conference. And for me, there's a few reasons. So over the last couple of years at Diabetes UK, we've been looking at the understanding what diabetes stigma is and what we can do as an organisation about it. And we've been working from the premise that no health condition deserves to be stigmatised. No one living with a health condition deserves to face stigma because of that. And so we believe there are things that we can learn from others working in tackling stigma, and we hope there's things you can learn from us as well. Similarly, we're working from the premise that we don't want to remove diabetes-related stigma by inadvertently casting stigma elsewhere. So it's important for us to come to events like today and learn from you so we can work together. And finally, as part of our research, we have learned that there is a link between diabetes-related stigma and weight-related stigma. We know that there is a link between diabetes and obesity. And we know that much like type 2, the drivers of obesity are complex, they're multifaceted, and they're out of a person's control, as we've been hearing already. We believe that at Diabetes UK, we have a responsibility to address this, and we're going to start understanding this link between obesity and diabetes-related stigma. So, to develop our approach for addressing stigma, we commissioned some research and we asked Magenta market research agency to do this for us. And the reason we did this was we'd noticed a bit of a mismatch in between the anecdotal feedback we'd heard from our supporters that they were facing stigmatizing and discriminatory experiences because of their diabetes, and the quantitative research where we directly asked this, and sometimes, but not always, people said that they weren't experiencing it. And so we wanted to understand the prevalence, the experiences, and the impact of these stigmatizing experiences. The objectives of the research are here. You can see the 4 objectives. We wanted to establish the breadth of personal experiences that people had. We wanted to understand the immediate and long-term impact of stigma. We wanted to understand what range of views people considered stigmatizing. And we wanted to identify the source of these stigmatizing experiences, the direct and the indirect. And I'm pleased we'll be able to, we did all of this in the research. Unfortunately, I won't be able to cover all of it in the next 10 minutes, but do come find me if you have any questions. I'm going to focus on 4 key findings. A bit on methodology. So it was 3 stages, the research, as you can see on the slide. The first stage was a series of in-depth interviews with people living with type 1, with type 2, and also gestational diabetes. We wanted to have people's real-life experiences and use their own language as what they described as stigmatizing experiences. So we asked them to complete a 2-week follow-up diary where they could record experiences that they actually hadn't noticed before that were stigmatizing about their diabetes. And then we used this terminology that they gave us and these experiences to develop a survey of 450 respondents. There was people living with, people at risk of diabetes, both type 1 and type 2. And across the sample, we had a representative view of people, a representative range of people living with diabetes. 2 quick notes before I go into the details. If you see an asterisk, it's where there's a statistically significant difference in people living with type 1 and type 2 of their experiences, and all names have been changed. Some of the quotes, I think it's really important to include people's own words, but inevitably they are quite difficult to hear at times. So we found that the vast majority of people were aware of misconceptions. In fact, 9 in 10 people living with diabetes had experienced stigma. Almost half of them had personally experienced the misconception that diabetes is caused by eating too much sugar. And what was really unfortunate is we found that many of the respondents actually internalized these views themselves. So in that internalized stigma we've been hearing about. So this slide on the left, you can see different myths and misconceptions that people raise themselves around diabetes in the first two parts of the research. And the bar chart shows the percentage of respondents who actually believe these themselves. So I draw your attention to the top three, where around half or more believed the three misconceptions that blood sugar highs and lows are caused by poor management of their own condition, or poor management of food, that any children were likely to inherit diabetes if the parent has it, and also that diabetes is caused by eating too much sugar. We found that people living with type 2 are more likely to believe that diabetes is their own fault. This was 39% of our respondents overall. And we found that ethnicity plays a role in how much people internalize their beliefs, and I'll go on to that shortly in a moment. Our second finding was that stigma means that over half of people living with diabetes will miss healthcare appointments, and I know there's going to be more detail on this later. So this is poor care, perceived judgments, and a lack of understanding from healthcare professionals mean that people are actively missing their chance to speak to a healthcare professional, and we know that this will have long-term effects on their health and their well-being. So to delve into this a bit deeper, it was 1 in 5 experienced stigma from healthcare professionals at least a few times a year. And when we asked what would help people to address the stigma, they said 72% would find training for healthcare professionals in how diabetes affects people differently would be useful. So this manifested itself in different ways. Broadly, the theme was people felt that they were treated as a condition rather than an individual person living with that condition. They found that healthcare professionals would make comments that would negatively impact them. They felt othered, they felt told off, that their lifestyle, in inverted commas, hadn't improved, and there was a lack of understanding about how diabetes would affect people differently. We found that particularly people living with type 2 diabetes felt judged and patronized by healthcare professionals. And some quotes to depict this. He just laughed and said, "But you're white and you're thin." He just couldn't get over that I wasn't like his usual patients. He just kept saying it. It made me feel like even more of an oddity. And I wish my doctors and specialist nurses were more understanding. They just don't get it. They're so academic, whereas I'm more interested in the practical side of things. We found that people with South Asian heritage, which we oversampled for in the research, experience stigma intensely. And this is despite the prevalence of diabetes in the community. For some, this means that they would internalize diabetes stigma, as we've seen. And for others, they would actually make significant life decisions because of it. So we heard from people who decided not to have children because of diabetes stigma. This manifested itself in different ways as well. So overall, Asian or Asian British respondents were 80% of them said that they experienced negative attitudes. And this was compared to 61% of the white participants. We found that family members would often seek to understand why someone had this condition when others didn't. People were asked to hide their condition. And from family members or potential spouses, we heard an example of one participant who'd had their marriage ended because of diabetes stigma. And we heard from some respondents about seeking to rationalize their diagnosis of diabetes because of the religion or because of karma. There were examples of other cultures and how they see diabetes differently too. In some languages, there isn't a word for diabetes, it just translates as sugar. So there isn't necessarily the language around it that can be talked about without perpetuating stigma. And we found that in some participants, they mentioned about Chinese beauty standards, particularly for women, expecting women to be submissive and petite. And so therefore, having dietary requirements was seen as making a fuss. We hope to be able to do more research into this in 2024, where we'll be looking into Black African and Black Caribbean respondents and their experience of stigma as well. And some quotes to depict this. I asked my grandpa, who had his leg amputated, why did it happen to him? He said in his previous life, we all used to work in a sugar factory, and we used to steal the sugar. In this life, for every time we tasted the sugar, we get 1 year of diabetes. It's God's own sweet justice. And dating is difficult. Trying to arrange a marriage, the parents of the bride would think that you are defective and would think our children will be like that too. We found that friends, family, and colleagues are the most prominent sources of impactful stigma. And by this, as you'll see on the slide, we asked people about the strength of response they had when they experienced a stigmatizing view, and then the frequency this happens, to understand what the overall impact on self is. So we found that as a result of a combination of the strength of response and the frequency it happens, it was friends, family, and colleagues that had the biggest impact. So while stigma in the media is annoying and happens a lot, in our research we found that in terms of diabetes it has less of an impact. There's lots of theories about this, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on them later perhaps. So we found that 1 in 5 participants experience stigma in at least every few weeks in the workplace, and I know we'll hear more about that shortly as well, about weight-related stigma. And 1 in 4 experience stigma in the home at least weekly. We heard about particularly participants living with type 2, they had comments from their family about a lack of exercise and an unhealthy lifestyle. And this was done with often kind of maybe ill-advised intent, but with the hope that it would keep people on track, but had quite the opposite effect. So what does all this mean for what we're going to do about it at Diabetes UK? It means a few things. We've published these findings in full. So they're in Diabetic Medicine, and a huge thank you to colleagues at Diabetic Medicine, so Vicky McKechnie, Katrina Skior, Nick Oliver, and also Andy Broomhead from Diabetes UK, who worked on publishing this research. We're funding some multi-year projects into diabetes-related stigma, so 1 into gestational diabetes and 1 into type 1 stigma. And we're going to start proactively talking about stigma more and more. We're doing this slowly to understand what the response is, but I'm pleased, as we posted about this research last month, and it was our best performing post on social media, and I hope this is indicative of the response we'll get from our community on this important issue. In the short term, we want to enable people to share their experiences about what happens when they experience discrimination as a result of their diabetes. And we want to support them as they experience this discrimination as well, as we start to change hearts and minds more broadly. We're engaging with our existing audiences, so healthcare professionals, as we've seen as a suggestion from the participants. As we look to the long term, when we start to change the public's attitudes, their knowledge and their perception of what diabetes is. All of this we'll do in conjunction with people with lived experience of diabetes and of diabetes stigma, so we know we're going in the right direction. And we're also mindful of doing the work in conjunction with our commitments to tackling inequality. We know there is a link between poverty and between diabetes, and we aren't going to be able to tackle the stigma of one without looking at that as well. So thank you very much for listening. And I don't know if we have time for any questions. I think quite possibly.
So I would invite questions from any of you, and also from people online. If, those who are online, you can ask questions through the chat of Teams. So please do so as we go. While somebody come up with questions, I'll ask you one myself. So we have seen that there are some similarities with obesity. We're talking about two chronic diseases, and some of the aspects of obesity stigma seems to be very similar. So do you think that what do you think is the reason why people stigmatize both conditions? Is this an idea that is both of them are associated with something that has to do with food and food choices, or has to be looked in something else?
I think inevitably it is to do with food. Partly, we're aware of the link between food and diabetes. What we've learned is that diabetes stigma is so complex because there's different types of diabetes as well. So there are other types of stigma. We heard about needle use stigma as well. So I think the issue that presents is that because diabetes-related stigma is so complex, inevitably the solution to addressing it will be as well.
One in the back.
Okay. Hi, I'm Eugenia Romano from King's College. Very interesting talk. I've worked a lot, I still work a lot on stigma, and I have a strong interest in the stigma of obesity. This is actually the first time I hear about the specific stigma of diabetes, though, which is very interesting. And so I can't help but wonder if ideally, hopefully soon, we do resolve the whole issue around obesity stigma, because I think society is becoming more aware of it. Do you think it could benefit the work on the stigma of diabetes, or do you think there is something in the mechanism of this stigma and specifically of this condition that make it a separate issue that needs more specific strategies to tackle it? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, brilliant question. I think inevitably being able to address obesity-related stigma, as we've seen, that's such a common thread in diabetes-related stigma, it will advance our cause. There are nuances as well we need to bear in mind. We are aware that the drivers of type 2, as I mentioned, are complex, they're multifaceted, and there's lots of them. So we need to bear those in mind, and we also need to bear other types of diabetes in mind as well in terms of addressing that stigma. More broadly, I would say, and I would hope that addressing any type of healthcare or health-related stigma will advance the cause more broadly as we start to have open conversations about how it's not appropriate to stigmatize communicable, non-communicable diseases. That will help us too.
Hello, not a question for you, Danny. I work with Danny at Diabetes UK. My name's Lucy Chambers. Just wanted to make people aware, in case you're not, that Jane Spate's group in Australia has recently published a consensus statement around diabetes stigma, and it's a framework really for the community to get behind diabetes stigma, sign up to a pledge, much like the obesity stigma pledge, and understanding that the consensus statement was developed with bringing people with diabetes and experts from across the world. So published in January. Take a look if you haven't seen it. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy.
Thank you for that. One question probably from online.
From online, Zareen is asking, do we find any link between stigma and moralizing diabetes in the context as religion or other frameworks to talk about diabetes?
Yeah, big question. I think probably the sample that we had, we're not able to make huge amounts of assumptions from that. But actually, to go back to the first question, I think the common thread is probably fear. That is what underpins a lot of stigma, fear and miseducation. And so there's a link there, is my hunch. We don't have the research to back it up yet, but maybe as part of our continued efforts and new research on that, we will. Thank you. Thank you very much.